For this video, I'm going to be going over a couple of usage tips for my Sketchy shader. I'm going to be showing you how to apply it and how to go through some of the presets to customize the way that it looks. Right now, I just have a Guy 7 figure loaded up into the scene, and he's got kind of a surfer look to him. The first thing that I want to do before we start making changes is to turn on the interactive renderer. This will just let us see the changes that we make in real time as we apply them. It'll take a little bit of time the first time that we enable this as it loads the textures into the renderer. Once this is finished though, everything else that we load should go quite a bit faster since most of the scene is already loaded. Most of the presets that we're going to be loading are only going to be using one texture at a time at most. Once the scene starts rendering, you can see that we're using all of the default render settings. This includes the HDRI that's loaded by default and all of the brightness values that come along with it. Switching over to the perspective camera, you can see exactly what we're working with at this point. There's really not a whole lot going on, but we're going to be doing a portrait illustration, so we don't need too much. Now that we're able to see the changes we're going to be making, I want to load one of the HDRIs that I included with the set. There's two separate HDRI presets that are meant to just produce completely neutral lighting. This preset has a little bit of a gradient, so it's slightly darker coming from the bottom, while this one is completely neutral and has light of the same brightness coming from every single direction. For this video, I'm going to be using the gradient preset, but you're completely free to use whatever lighting that you like. With our lighting set up, it's a good time to look over the presets that come with this set. I have them all categorized and numbered in the order that you're most likely to use them in. The first folder contains a collection of full presets that are going to change every aspect of the shader. After that, we have Solid Color Diffuse, which is a collection of color presets that will only modify the color and not any other part of the shader. Then we have Toon Diffuse modifiers, which will affect the first of two outline layers. Because there's two layers, we can do some interesting effects, which I'll be showing you later. Next in the list is Toon Outline modifiers, which affects the second layer of outline. Both of these folders contain a bunch of color presets and contrast settings. The last folder here contains numerous draw style settings that we can use to change the way that our image is drawn. You'll also find scale values for the draw style setting that's currently loaded. Now we can get into the fun stuff and actually start loading up some presets. In my opinion, Basic Shader A under Full Shaders is a good place to start. The settings that it uses are very generalized and middle of the road, so to speak. Before we apply any shaders, we first have to select the surface that we want to apply it to. If you've never used it before, you can find the surface selection tool up in the toolbar at the top. By clicking on this and then clicking on an object, you'll select that surface within your scene. You can also control click on multiple surfaces to select them all at once. Once we have those selected, we can double click on the preset to have it load. You can see that these presets keep the texture already loaded on the hair and only apply the Toon effect over top of it. Looking at the Surfaces tab, you can see that this loads a bunch of new values that we can play with. Most of the time though, you can get good results by loading just the presets that are included with the set rather than playing with the shader itself. I'm going to continue loading this preset over the rest of our character. For now, I'm only going to be applying it to the skin, lips, and nails group. This means that it's not going to be making any changes to his eyes or his eyelashes. Once it loads, you can see that it's adding the outline effect to his skin without removing his skin textures. I actually want to apply this to his mouth as well, so I'm going to select the teeth and apply it there. His tongue and gums aren't really visible, so I'm not going to worry about that. Moving on, I'm going to apply the same preset to his shirt, making sure that I select both of the surfaces that the shirt has. When you're using the surface selection tool, it's a little easy to select only parts of the object when you mean to select all of it, but you can always just select the rest of the object in the Surfaces tab. After we're done there, we can move on to the pants and apply the same preset to all of the surfaces there. At this point, everything within our viewport is pretty well toonified, but I do know that he's wearing a pair of shoes that we need to apply these presets to. If you know that the shoes aren't going to be in your scene, there's not really any reason to apply the presets to it, but I just get used to doing the whole figure and all the clothing that he has applied to him. Once the shader is applied to everything, it might be a good idea to take some time and see how it behaves by rotating the camera around it. One tip that I think might be useful to you is with the surface selection tool, you can right click and get this dialog box. From here you can do a number of things, but I'm going to be selecting all surfaces that use the Toon shader. This will automatically select every single surface that we've already applied the presets to. This will make things a lot faster when you want to make changes to every surface in your scene at the same time. You can see as we flip through these presets that it's making the same changes to his skin as it's making to his tank top and his hair. This might be a good time to develop an overall tone for the image that you want to create by using these base presets as an example. If at any time you want to deselect the surfaces that you have selected, you can just click anywhere in the scene that doesn't have an object. This will get rid of that effect that shows up when you're highlighting surfaces and give you a better idea of what your final render is going to look like. With the shader applied to everything that we want it applied to, we can start making changes to the diffuse color with the presets that I've included. You're not always going to want to use these, but I've included them just for the times that you do. You can see that they're changing the overall brightness and hue of your surfaces without replacing the textures. They are, however, most useful when you're working with an object that doesn't have any textures already applied to it. There is actually a preset here that removes the textures, and that's the white one. The idea is that most surfaces already come loaded with a white diffused color. So if you're loading it, it's most likely because you want a solid color rather than something textured. For now I do want textures though, so I just undid that and we can move on to the next section. The first couple of presets in the diffuse modifiers will enable and disable the outline effect on the first layer. When using these, keep in mind that there's two layers of outline, so if the second layer is enabled, you might not see the first layer disable. All of the full shaders use both layers of outline, so it's most likely that the second layer is going to be enabled. After these two presets, you'll find some dark and diffuse presets. These presets will get rid of the actual outline effect of the first layer and replace it with something that just darkens the diffuse color. These will be useful when using the solid color diffuse presets because these will help darken the hues that you'll find there. To replace the outline effect that it's removed, I'm going to go back to the full shaders and use the original preset that we loaded. Now we can go back to the diffuse modifiers and start to mess with the edge strength presets that I've included. These all work in tandem with the contrast presets to adjust how dark and how hard the lined edges are. At first, the contrast and strength settings might appear to do the same things, but once you start using draw styles, you'll notice that they affect each other differently. Next in line after the contrast presets are a suite of normal presets. Right now they behave the same way as the darken presets, but they'll do something a little bit different once we start using draw style settings. After that, we have all of the color presets that are specific to the first layer of outline. Because the second layer of outline is black and it's applying over the first layer of outline, we're not really seeing much difference as we switch between colors. This is also something that will become more useful once we start using the draw style settings. The next presets that we're going to be looking at are the ones that apply to that second layer of outline. Pretty much everything here does the same sort of thing as the presets that we just covered, only applying to the second layer of outline instead of the first. By loading some color presets here, we can actually see the changes that it's making. These might not always be the most useful, but there's certain situations where they can produce some really nice results. For example, you can have the first layer of outline be a red color with the second layer being a black color, so you get that two-toned red inside of black look. After those modifiers, we can finally get down to the draw styles and start to have some fun with what we find there. Each of the presets here will load a different texture to use as the draw style, and you can find one for the first layer and the second layer of outline. This means you can use a different texture draw style for the first layer than you do for the second layer. It's probably best when loading these to switch to a different camera view and zoom in close so you can see what they're doing. This particular preset loads a number of small circles, which looks similar to something like an old printer technique. Before we make changes, we want to find an area of the render that shows the effect pretty well. In this situation, the side of his face with a shadow on his nose seems pretty nice. With a close-up view like this, it's going to be a lot easier to see the adjustments that we make to scale. These features can get almost infinitely small as you scale them down, so you're likely not to see them as you're zoomed out. Flipping through the scale presets, you'll notice that the patterns get smaller and smaller. The density of these effects is an interesting way to create shading between two different surfaces. When thinking about how printers work, the way that it creates darker areas is producing a higher density of dots. We can do the same thing here by adjusting the scale and messing with our contrast settings. Because these features are somewhat resolution dependent, it is probably best to do some test renders when you're making your final adjustments. You'll want to make sure that they're going to look correct with the actual resolution that you're rendering to. Before we move on to the rest of the adjustments I want to make, I'm going to load the sketch preset. I think this draw style is probably my favorite, but it's also going to be very useful when showing you some of the things that we can do. With the draw style loaded, we can see what the modifiers that I mentioned earlier are actually doing now. The first thing I want to do is go back and load some of the contrast adjustments. You'll notice that there's a difference in how the sketch effect is drawn based on how high the contrast is. Higher contrast produces thicker, darker lines on more of the model. We can also now see how those normal presets that I mentioned earlier actually behave. Essentially what they're doing is adding more of that draw style effect to the front of the model rather than just on the sides. So you can think of the normal presets as filling in while the outline presets are drawing around. I like to have a little bit of this on the normal to make the effect more uniform. Just as I mentioned before, these settings are going to apply the same way to both the first and the second layer of outline. This means that your first and second layer can have different values for the contrast and the normal. With this, you can have a different draw style for the outline than you do for what's filling in the rest of your model. Scrolling down a bit, we can finally see exactly what we can do with different colors on the second and first layer. Since both layers are using different contrast values, the first layer is applying to different parts of the model than the second layer. This means that any color that we apply to the first layer is going to kind of bleed out from behind the second. This can look pretty cool with some fine tuning, and you might get some results that look similar to graffiti or other kinds of street art. Again, it's not something that you're always going to want to do, but I think that it can be a lot of fun to play with. From here, I would like to show you what I did to get the style that I used in some of the promos for this product. To do that, I'm going to go back and load the solid white color that we loaded before, which removed all of our textures. I really like this look because to me it looks the most like it's drawn on paper. You might notice though that it doesn't look right because we're still only applying it to his skin, so I'm going to start applying presets to his eyes now. I'm going to go ahead and select every single surface that he has to make sure that we apply it to every surface we haven't yet. First, I'm just going to load this white preset again to get rid of the textures on his eyeballs. Because the eye moisture uses refraction for transparency and because the shader doesn't have refraction, we have to replace that with cutout. After selecting the eye moisture surface, we can scroll down and find cutout opacity and just lower that down to 0. This will completely remove the eye moisture surface and let us see what's going on behind it. It's still looking a little bit strange just because everything is a solid white color and there's no actual definition to the iris or the pupil yet. So we're going to select the iris and start applying some presets to make that a different shade. I'm going to be using some draw style presets to make those changes, but since I want to use the sketchy style on his eyes too, I'm just going to copy what we have so far on his face over to the iris. If you've never done it before, you can right click on a surface in the surface tab to bring up a menu that will let you both copy and paste to the selected surface. Along with pasting to the irises, I'm also pasting to the pupils and the sclera. After that, we're going to start making some scale changes to modify the density of this effect like I mentioned earlier. This of course is just down to user preference, so I'm just going to switch between the scale presets until I find something that looks pleasing to me. While I'm doing this, I'm also going to keep in mind that we're not going to be rendering this close to the eyeball, so the detail might not need to be this high. Once we get a level of detail that we're happy with, we can go back to the Toon outline modifiers and start to play with the contrast. I want to find something that ends up being kind of a mid-gray value. I don't want it to be too dark because it's just going to blend in with the pupil and you're not going to see any definition there. By changing the contrast and the strength settings, you're able to fine-tune it with quite a bit more control. I think something like that looks pretty good, so now I'm going to switch over to the pupils and basically make those solid black. You don't want to forget about the eyelashes either, so I'm going to select those now and just apply the same contrast settings to make those black as well. Once I've done that, I'm going to switch back to my rendering camera to get an idea for what my render is going to be looking like at this point. And you can see it's looking pretty close to some of the promos that I did. One thing that I found was pretty cool is that you can make a quick background in this sketchy style by just adding a sphere to your scene and placing it behind your character. So I'm going to go up to the menu at the top and create a new primitive and select the sphere. After that, I'm going to switch to my perspective view again so I can get a better view of the sphere as we're positioning it. I just want to move it behind him by a little bit of a distance to make sure that it's not clipping when we start scaling it up because it's going to need to be a little bit bigger. When I was setting up the scenes from my promos, I made sure that this sphere was pretty much centered with the camera. You can offset it a little bit though to add some directionality from the sketch effect that we're going to be producing. It might be a little bit easier for you to switch back to texture view when you're positioning the sphere, but I didn't want to make the renderer stop and have to load back up when we render again. Once we get it behind him and positioned relatively well, we can start to scale up the sphere to make sure that it fills up the rest of the scene. Once we get it where we want it at the size that we need, we're going to apply the shader to it. Since I want it to be the same style as the character that we've been working on, I'm just going to copy the surface from his tank top. Since we're going to be pasting existing properties, it doesn't necessarily matter which preset that we load to apply the shader to the sphere. Once that's been pasted, we can go back to the modifiers and start to fine-tune this background to make it look exactly how we want it to. To make sure that the character stands out against the background, I would like to make the background quite a bit darker. So I used some normal presets to fill it in a bit more and used a high contrast setting to finish it all off. That about does it for this guide. I hope that you were able to learn a few things, and I hope that you have some fun rendering. I'll be looking forward to seeing what you come up with.